In October 1877, 15 men boarded a grounded wreck at dawn off Newfoundland. By noon, when the rescue ship arrived, all boats were still tied to the steamer Celestial, but every man was gone. No storm, no accident, no bodies. Searchers found 15 sets of wet footprints leading from work areas straight to the ship's bow, stopping dead at the railing. Tools lay abandoned mid-task, half-eaten meals sat cooling. The most chilling discovery was the crew boss's journal, his final entry, written in shaking handwriting. Strange that all the clocks show different times. We should leave. Every timepiece aboard had stopped at different hours, the ship's chronometer, pocket watches, the wheelhouse clock, all frozen at impossible moments. One fisherman swore he saw all 15 men walking the shoreline that afternoon, 3 miles away, moving in perfect single file. If they didn't drown and didn't jump, where did 15 experienced sailors vanish in broad daylight? Before we uncover what happened aboard the Celestial, subscribe and comment your city and local time. These maritime mysteries reach around the world. Thomas Harwick stepped off the coastal steamer at St. John's Harbor with the methodical precision of a man who had learned to trust routine above all else. 20 years of investigating maritime insurance claims had taught him that the sea kept its secrets through misdirection, and the only defense against being deceived was an unwavering commitment to documented fact. His leather satchel contained the preliminary reports on the Celestial incident, but he had learned long ago that paper testimony was often the least reliable part of any investigation. The October wind carried the familiar scent of salt and tar, mixed with the sharper bite of approaching winter. Harwick had worked cases from the Mediterranean to the Baltic, but Newfoundland waters held a particular reputation among maritime investigators. Ships died differently here, where the Grand Banks met the Labrador Current, in a convergence of forces that could claim vessels with startling efficiency. What made the Celestial case unusual was not that she had foundered — autumn gales regularly drove ships onto these rocky shores — but that she had become the center of an incident that defied every precedent in his professional experience. The grounded steamer sat visible from the harbor mouth. Her dark hull canted at a 10-degree list to starboard, bow wedged firmly against the jagged rocks of Conception Bay. Even from this distance, Harwick could see she remained structurally intact, her single stack still upright, her superstructure showing no signs of catastrophic damage. A 400-ton cargo vessel carrying prairie wheat to Halifax, the Celestial had been driven ashore during the September gales, a routine casualty that should have resulted in a routine salvage operation. Harwick made his way through the narrow streets to the harbor master's office, where Captain Morris Sullivan's reputation preceded him like a good wind. 15 years of successful salvage operations, a crew of experienced local men, and a methodical approach that had never lost a man to preventable accident. Sullivan's Salvage Company held contracts with 3 major shipping lines and maintained equipment that rivaled anything available in Halifax or Boston. When the Celestial's owners contracted Sullivan to strip her cargo and assess hull damage, it should have been a textbook operation lasting no more than a week. The preliminary report from Lloyd's of London contained the essential facts, presented with the bureaucratic precision that revealed nothing of the growing unease among local maritime authorities. On October 12, 1877, Captain Sullivan departed St. John's Harbor at dawn with 14 men in 3 salvage boats, bound for the wreck site under clear skies and moderate seas. Weather conditions remained stable throughout the morning, with northeast winds at 15 knots and visibility exceeding 10 miles. The salvage operation commenced at approximately 0700 hours, with crew members boarding the Celestial to begin cargo assessment and equipment positioning. At 12:30 hours, the steam tug Providence approached the wreck site to deliver additional pumping equipment and found all 3 salvage boats still secured to the Celestial's port side, their mooring lines properly set and fenders in place. Captain James Morton of the Providence signaled the wreck with both horn and flag, receiving no response. Boarding parties found the salvage boats empty, with no crew members visible on the Celestial's deck or in her rigging. A search of the vessel revealed work tools arranged in organized groups, personal effects scattered as if abandoned mid-task, and no sign of the 15 men who had boarded 6 hours earlier. Harwick had investigated marine casualties involving missing persons before, but those cases typically involved storms, equipment failures, or human error that left clear evidence of what had occurred. Men swept overboard by heavy seas, crushed by shifting cargo, or overcome by toxic gases in poorly ventilated holds. Maritime death followed predictable patterns that experienced investigators could reconstruct from physical evidence. The Celestial incident contained none of these familiar markers. The lighthouse keeper's log provided the most reliable timeline of events. Edmund Thorne had maintained the Avalon Peninsula Light for 16 years, and his weather observations showed the mechanical precision of a man whose accuracy could mean the difference between safe passage and disaster for approaching vessels. His entries for October 12th documented the salvage boats departing harbor at 06:45 hours under fair conditions, with moderate swells and northeast winds steady at 12 to 15 knots. Barometric pressure held steady at 30-15 inches throughout the morning, indicating stable weather with no sign of the sudden squalls that occasionally claimed small boats in these waters. Thorne's optical equipment allowed him to observe the wreck site from his elevated position, and his testimony would prove crucial to understanding the morning's events. Through his telescope, he had watched the salvage boats approach the Celestial in proper formation, maintaining safe intervals and following established protocols for approaching a grounded vessel. The crews had boarded without incident, and normal salvage activities appeared to commence immediately. At no point during his periodic observations did Thorne witness any sign of distress, unusual activity, or departure of personnel from the wreck. The cargo manifest indicated the Celestial carried 340 tons of prairie wheat in sealed holds, along with general cargo, including agricultural equipment bound for maritime provinces. Initial examination by Sullivan's crew had found the grain in surprisingly good condition, despite the ship's 3 weeks aground, suggesting her hull remained largely watertight and cargo spaces had suffered minimal water damage. This assessment aligned with standard salvage expectations and provided no indication of hazardous conditions that might threaten an experienced crew. Harwick's professional instincts, honed by 2 decades of separating fact from fabrication, detected something fundamentally wrong with the available evidence. Maritime accidents followed logical progressions, equipment failures that could be traced to specific causes, weather events that left characteristic damage patterns, human errors that revealed themselves through inconsistent testimony or physical contradictions. The Celestial incident contained none of these familiar elements. Instead, it presented the far more troubling scenario of 15 experienced men simply vanishing from a stationary vessel under perfect working conditions. The insurance implications alone demanded thorough investigation. Lloyd's of London faced potential claims exceeding £12,000, covering not only the vessel and cargo, but also compensation for the missing salvage crew. More troubling was the precedent such a case might establish if ruled an unexplained marine casualty. Shipping companies throughout the North Atlantic would demand answers before authorizing future salvage operations in Newfoundland waters, potentially disrupting commerce throughout the region. As evening shadows lengthened across St. John's Harbor, Harwick stood at his lodging house window, studying the distant silhouette of the Celestial. Tomorrow he would begin the methodical process of interviewing witnesses, examining physical evidence, and reconstructing the morning's events through careful analysis of every available fact. But already, the case exhibited characteristics that challenged his fundamental understanding of how ships, men, and the sea interacted under normal circumstances. The grounded steamer sat motionless against the rocks, her outline stark against the darkening sky. Whatever had happened to Morris Sullivan and his 14 men, the answers lay aboard that silent vessel, waiting for an investigator experienced enough to read the story written in abandoned tools and empty boats. Captain James Morton stood at the wheel of the steam tug Providence, studying the Celestial through his binoculars with the methodical attention of a man who had learned that carelessness at sea killed more mariners than storms. The grounded steamer lay 200 yards ahead, her black hull gleaming wet in the noon sun, 3 salvage boats still secured to her port side with their mooring lines drawn taut against the moderate swell. What troubled Morton was not what he could see, but what he could not. No movement on deck, no response to his steam whistle, no acknowledgement of his approach despite repeated signals. The Providence had departed St. John's at 1100 hours, carrying additional pumping equipment for Sullivan's salvage operation, a routine supply run that Morton had executed dozens of times over his 10 years commanding cargo vessels in Newfoundland waters. His crew of 4 included an engineer and 2 deckhands experienced in ship-to-ship transfers, men who could read sea conditions and vessel stability with the unconscious expertise that kept small boats operating safely around dangerous wrecks. As they approached the Celestial, Morton noted the favorable conditions: northeast winds at 12 knots, moderate swell with occasional whitecaps, visibility clear to the horizon. Perfect weather for salvage work. Morton's first attempt at communication followed established maritime protocol: 3 long blasts on the steam whistle, followed by a pause, then 3 short blasts to signal his approach. The sound echoed off the rocky shoreline and returned as a hollow mockery, but no answering signal came from the Celestial. Through his binoculars, Morton could see work equipment scattered across the wreck's deck: block and tackle rigging, coils of rope, wooden crates that marked the organized staging areas where Sullivan's crew had begun their cargo assessment. But no human figures moved among the equipment, no heads appeared at the rail to acknowledge the Providence's arrival. The second attempt involved flag signals, using the International Maritime Code that any experienced salvage crew would recognize immediately. Morton ran up flags indicating "require assistance" and preparing to come alongside, standard communications for vessels approaching active salvage operations. Still no response from the silent wreck. The salvage boats rode easily at their moorings, their hulls clean and undamaged, their oars shipped properly, and equipment stowed according to normal practice. Everything appeared normal except for the complete absence of the 15 men who should have been visible on deck or working in the Celestial's holds. Morton brought the Providence alongside the largest salvage boat, a 30-foot launch capable of carrying 8 men and their equipment. His engineer, David Ross, threw a line across the gap and made the vessels fast, while Morton studied the abandoned boat's interior. Personal effects lay scattered across the thwarts: tobacco pouches, pipes still packed but unlit, a pocket watch hanging from its chain where someone had looped it around a rowing pin. The boat's equipment remained properly secured, with no sign of hasty departure or emergency evacuation. Most tellingly, the boat's bailing bucket sat dry in the stern sheets, indicating no recent use despite the moderate seas that should have required periodic bailing throughout the morning. The boarding of the Celestial itself revealed a scene that would haunt Morton for the remainder of his career. Sullivan's crew had clearly been working with their characteristic efficiency. Cargo hatches stood open with proper ventilation. Work tools were arranged in organized groups according to specific tasks, and staging areas showed the methodical preparation that marked professional salvage operations. In the forward hold, Wooden crates of grain had been opened and sampled, with canvas tarps laid out to protect the cargo from weather. The work showed every sign of normal progress, as if the crew had simply paused for a meal break and would return momentarily to continue their tasks. The ship's galley contained the most disturbing evidence of interrupted activity. 15 tin cups sat arranged on the mess table, half filled with coffee that had grown cold hours earlier. Hardtack biscuits lay on wooden plates beside portions of salt pork, the meal preparation suggesting the crew had gathered for their midday break when something occurred that caused them to abandon their food untouched. The coffee pot remained warm on its gimbaled stove, indicating the galley fire had been maintained until recently. Yet no cook or mess attendant remained to tend the equipment. Morton's methodical search of the vessel revealed personal effects distributed throughout the work areas in patterns that suggested normal activity rather than emergency abandonment. In the wheelhouse, he found a leather-bound journal open to an entry dated October 12th, the handwriting clearly legible, but ending mid-sentence as if the writer had been interrupted while recording routine observations. Pipes lay on various surfaces where they had been set down temporarily, still warm to the touch, and packed with tobacco that had been lit but never finished. Pocket watches hung from pegs and hooks throughout the vessel, creating an eerie chronological record of the morning's work, but every timepiece had stopped at a different hour, creating a temporal confusion that defied logical explanation. The most significant discovery came in the crew's staging area amidships, where Morton found clear evidence of the 15 men's final movements. Wet footprints, still damp despite hours of exposure to sun and wind, formed distinct trails leading from the various work locations toward the ship's bow. The prints showed the characteristic pattern of heavy work boots, each set clearly individual in size and wear pattern, creating 15 separate tracks that converged near the forward rail. But at the bow itself, the footprints simply ended, with no corresponding marks on the deck beyond the rail, and no evidence of anyone entering the water. Morton examined the rail itself for signs of departure, rope marks, scuff patterns, or damage that might indicate emergency evacuation, but found none. The rail stood undamaged, its paint intact, showing no sign that 15 men had climbed over it into the sea. More puzzling was the absence of any disturbance in the water below. The moderate seas should have shown some evidence of multiple bodies entering the water simultaneously, disturbed surface patterns, floating debris, or the oil slicks that often marked drowning sites. Instead, the water around the Celestial's bow remained clear and undisturbed, showing only the normal patterns of waves breaking against the grounded hull. The technical evidence deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. The Celestial's compass, examined in the wheelhouse, showed severe deviation from magnetic north, its needle oscillating randomly rather than holding steady on any bearing. Similar magnetic anomalies affected the salvage boat's compasses, creating navigation conditions that experienced mariners would have found deeply unsettling. Temperature readings taken in the ship's holds revealed conditions 15 degrees cooler than expected for October, suggesting some form of environmental disturbance that standard meteorological knowledge could not explain. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the wreck site, Morton faced the unavoidable conclusion that 15 experienced salvage workers had vanished from a stationary vessel under perfect working conditions, leaving behind only their tools, their unfinished meals, and a trail of wet footprints that led nowhere. The implications for maritime safety and salvage operations throughout the region demanded immediate investigation, but the physical evidence challenged every conventional explanation for how men disappeared at sea. Standing at the Celestial's bow rail where the footprints ended, Morton stared into the clear water below and realized he was looking at something far more disturbing than a conventional marine casualty. He was witnessing the beginning of a mystery that would require investigators to question fundamental assumptions about how ships, crews, and the sea itself behaved under circumstances that should have been routine and safe. Thomas Harwick established his temporary office in the harbor master's quarters with the systematic precision that had made him Lloyd's most trusted investigator for complex marine casualties. His leather case contained the tools of methodical inquiry, surveying instruments, tide tables, weather records, and interview forms that would transform witness testimony into documented evidence capable of withstanding legal scrutiny. The Celestial case demanded more than routine investigation. It required the careful reconstruction of events that defied conventional maritime experience, pieced together from fragments of evidence that individually meant nothing but collectively might reveal the truth behind 15 missing men. The first formal interview was with Edmund Thorne, the lighthouse keeper whose elevated position at Avalon Peninsula Light provided the most comprehensive view of the wreck site. Thorne's weather log for October 12th showed the meticulous entries of a man whose professional survival depended on accurate observation, barometric pressure readings recorded every 4 hours, wind direction and velocity measured with instruments calibrated monthly, visibility assessments that distinguished between morning haze and true fog conditions. His testimony would establish the baseline of normal conditions against which any unusual events could be measured. Thorne's account of the morning began with standard observations that aligned perfectly with weather records maintained by other coastal stations. Northeast winds at 12 to 15 knots, barometric pressure steady at 30.15 inches, visibility excellent with scattered high clouds that posed no threat to small boat operations. The salvage boats had departed St. John's Harbor in proper formation, maintaining safe intervals as they approached the wreck site, their crews visible through Thorne's telescope as they prepared boarding equipment and assessed the Celestial's condition from alongside. What distinguished Thorne's testimony from routine weather observation was his growing awareness that something was fundamentally wrong with the marine environment around the wreck. Through his telescope, calibrated for precise distance measurement and optical clarity, he had observed tidal behavior that contradicted 16 years of experience monitoring these waters. The flood tide that should have raised water levels throughout the morning appeared to have no effect on the area immediately surrounding the Celestial, creating what he described as a pool of slack water that defied the normal tidal flow affecting the rest of the bay. Harwick's technical training allowed him to understand the implications of Thorne's observations. Tidal anomalies of this magnitude suggested either massive underwater obstruction or hydrodynamic forces that standard coastal charts failed to document. The lighthouse keeper's detailed knowledge of local current patterns made his testimony particularly valuable. He could distinguish between normal tidal variation and the kind of environmental disturbance that experienced mariners learned to recognize as a warning of dangerous conditions ahead. The interview with Captain James Morton of the Providence provided crucial details about the physical evidence discovered aboard the abandoned wreck. Morton's professional background as a cargo captain made him an ideal witness for technical assessment of salvage equipment and vessel condition. His description of the organized work areas, properly stowed equipment, and methodical arrangement of tools indicated that Sullivan's crew had been following standard salvage procedures throughout the morning, with no sign of the hasty improvisation that typically marked emergency situations. Morton's account of the wet footprints proved particularly significant under detailed questioning. As an experienced mariner familiar with deck safety and crew movement patterns, he could distinguish between the normal foot traffic of men working cargo and the specific trail pattern he had observed leading to the Celestial's bow. The footprints showed characteristics that suggested purposeful movement rather than random activity, 15 distinct sets of tracks converging from different work areas toward a single point at the forward rail. as if the entire crew had simultaneously abandoned their tasks to investigate something at the ship's bow. The technical aspects of Morton's testimony raised questions that standard maritime knowledge could not answer. The magnetic compass deviations he had observed exceeded anything in his 10 years of coastal navigation, creating conditions that would have been profoundly disorienting to men whose professional lives depended on reliable directional references. The temperature anomalies in the cargo holds suggested environmental conditions that defied seasonal norms, indicating either equipment malfunction or atmospheric disturbance beyond current meteorological understanding. Harwick's examination of the physical evidence revealed patterns that challenged his 20 years of investigative experience. The stop timepieces created a chronological puzzle that suggested either coordinated mechanical failure or exposure to environmental forces that affected precision instruments in unpredictable ways. Each timepiece had stopped at a different hour, creating a timeline of events that made no logical sense if viewed as a sequence of normal mechanical failures. The ship's chronometer, built to withstand the stresses of ocean navigation, should not have been affected by conditions that left less robust pocket watches still functioning. The most troubling aspect of the evidence was its internal consistency. Unlike insurance fraud cases, where perpetrators inevitably left contradictory clues that revealed their deception or accidental casualties, where human error created logical gaps in witness testimony, the celestial incident presented evidence that was both impossible and internally coherent. Every witness account aligned with physical evidence, every timepiece confirmed the temporal confusion suggested by other clues, and every environmental anomaly supported the growing impression that normal maritime physics had been suspended in the area around the wreck. Local fishermen provided additional testimony that deepened rather than resolved the mystery. Their accounts of dead water conditions near the wreck site corroborated Thorne's observations of tidal anomalies, while their reports of compass deviation supported Morton's technical findings. More disturbing were their descriptions of the sea's behavior around the Celestial, an unnatural stillness that experienced mariners recognized as fundamentally wrong, the kind of environmental warning that coastal fishermen had learned to heed without understanding its source. The medical consultation with Dr. Catherine Morse introduced the possibility that physiological factors might explain the crew's disappearance. Her expertise in maritime medical conditions provided a framework for analyzing potential causes of mass incapacitation, carbon monoxide poisoning from damaged ventilation systems, toxic gas accumulation in cargo holds, or psychological stress responses that could affect entire crews working in confined spaces. Her systematic approach to medical investigation offered hope that rational explanation might yet emerge from seemingly impossible evidence. But Dr. Morse's preliminary analysis revealed gaps that medical knowledge could not bridge. Carbon monoxide poisoning typically left visible evidence in both victims and environment, characteristic coloration, equipment damage, or atmospheric conditions that trained observers could detect and measure. The Celestial showed none of these markers, despite conditions that should have made any toxic exposure immediately apparent to investigators. More puzzling was the absence of bodies or any physical evidence that 15 men had suffered medical emergencies simultaneously. As evening approached, Harwick stood in his temporary office, reviewing witness statements and physical evidence that presented an increasingly coherent picture of an impossible event. The morning of October 12th had begun with normal weather, standard procedures, and experienced personnel following established protocols for routine salvage work. But somewhere between dawn and noon, 15 men had encountered something aboard the grounded steamer that caused them to abandon their work, their meals, and ultimately their lives, leaving behind only wet footprints that led to empty air and stopped timepieces that marked moments when normal time itself seemed to have faltered. The investigation was revealing not answers, but deeper questions, each piece of evidence confirming that something had occurred aboard the Celestial that lay beyond the boundaries of conventional maritime experience, something that would require Harwick to question fundamental assumptions about how ships, men, and the sea behaved under circumstances that should have been routine and safe. The breakthrough came through methodical analysis rather than dramatic revelation, emerging from Harwick's systematic correlation of witness testimony with geological surveys and magnetic deviation charts that revealed patterns invisible to individual observers. 3 days of intensive investigation had produced a working theory that satisfied both Lloyd's requirements for rational explanation and the professional standards that had built his reputation among maritime insurers. The evidence pointed toward a convergence of environmental factors, magnetic anomalies caused by iron ore deposits beneath the wreck site, combined with carbon monoxide accumulation from the Celestial's damaged ventilation system that had created conditions capable of disorienting an entire salvage crew simultaneously. The geological evidence provided the foundation for Harwick's theory. Survey maps from the Newfoundland Department of Mines revealed substantial magnetite deposits in the bedrock directly beneath the Celestial's grounding site, concentrations of iron ore sufficient to affect compass readings and create the kind of magnetic disturbance that experienced mariners found profoundly unsettling. Similar deposits throughout the North Atlantic were known to cause navigation problems for vessels equipped with iron hulls, and the Celestial's steel construction would have amplified any magnetic effects, creating environmental conditions that could explain both the compass deviations and the stopped timepieces that had puzzled investigators. Dr. Morse's medical analysis supported the environmental disturbance theory through her examination of the ship's ventilation systems and cargo hold conditions. The Celestial's damaged hull had allowed seawater to interact with her coal bunkers and cargo, creating the potential for toxic gas generation that could affect crew members working in confined spaces. Carbon monoxide poisoning, particularly in its early stages, produced symptoms that included disorientation, impaired judgment, and the kind of coordinated but irrational behavior that might cause an entire crew to abandon their work simultaneously and walk toward the ship's bow in response to shared hallucinations. The timeline established by stop timepieces aligned with medical knowledge of carbon monoxide exposure progression. The earliest stopped clock, the ship's chronometer at 7:41 a.m., corresponded with the crew's initial entry into the cargo holds where toxic gases would have been most concentrated. Subsequent timepiece failures at 9:33 a.m., 10:15 a.m., and 11:23 a.m. created a progression that matched the expected spread of carbon monoxide poisoning through a working crew, as individual members succumbed to disorientation and eventually lost consciousness while trying to escape the toxic environment. The wet footprints leading to the ship's bow represented the final stage of mass carbon monoxide poisoning, when the surviving crew members, already disoriented by magnetic anomalies and impaired by toxic gas exposure, had followed their officer toward what they believed was safety, but was actually the ship's forward rail. The absence of bodies in the water could be explained by the swift currents that characterized this section of the Newfoundland coast, particularly during the flood tide conditions that had prevailed throughout the morning of October 12th. Harwick's preliminary report to Lloyd's of London presented the environmental disturbance theory as the most probable explanation for the Celestial incident, supported by documented evidence of magnetic anomalies, toxic gas generation, and medical symptoms consistent with carbon monoxide poisoning. The report satisfied the insurance company's requirements for rational causation while acknowledging the unusual combination of factors that had created such tragic circumstances. Maritime safety recommendations included mandatory gas detection equipment for future salvage operations and enhanced magnetic deviation warnings for vessels operating near known mineral deposits. But the theory's apparent success was undermined by a single witness who had waited 4 days before coming forward with testimony that shattered every rational explanation Harwick had constructed. Patrick O'Brien, a 60-year-old fisherman whose knowledge of local waters was legendary among Conception Bay mariners, appeared at Harwick's temporary office on the evening of October 16th, with a statement that challenged not only the environmental disturbance theory, but the fundamental assumption that the missing crew members had died aboard the Celestial. O'Brien's delayed testimony stemmed from his initial disbelief in what he had witnessed, combined with the natural reluctance of Newfoundland fishermen to involve themselves in official investigations that might disrupt their informal networks of mutual assistance and shared knowledge. His account of the afternoon of October 12th began with routine fishing activity in waters 3 miles south of the wreck site, where he had been working alone in his dory while checking net lines set the previous day. At approximately 2:30 p.m., more than 2 hours after the Providence had discovered the empty salvage boats, O'Brien had observed 15 men walking along the shoreline in single file, moving with the purposeful but unnatural gait that he described as too steady, too straight for normal human movement. The figures maintained perfect spacing and identical pace, creating a formation that experienced mariners would recognize as drill formation, but which appeared profoundly wrong when executed by men who should have been struggling with exhaustion, injury, or the effects of near drowning. O'Brien's position in his fishing dory, approximately 200 yards offshore, provided clear visibility of the coastal area where the figures appeared. Weather conditions remained excellent throughout the afternoon, with the same northeast winds and clear visibility that had characterized the entire day, eliminating any possibility of optical illusion or weather-related misidentification. The fisherman's knowledge of every landmark, rock formation, and tidal pool along 20 miles of coastline made him an ideal witness for distinguishing between normal human activity and the disturbing spectacle he had observed. The most unsettling aspect of O'Brien's testimony was his description of the figure's response to his attempts at communication. Following maritime tradition, he had hailed the walking men with calls that should have been audible across the calm water, expecting acknowledgement from what he assumed were survivors of a marine accident requiring immediate assistance. Instead, the figures had continued their mechanical progression along the shoreline without any indication that they had heard his voice, maintaining their formation and pace, as if driven by purpose that transcended normal human awareness. When O'Brien looked again after adjusting his net lines, a process that required perhaps 30 seconds of attention, the figures had vanished completely, leaving no trace on a stretch of coastline that offered no concealment and few opportunities for rapid departure. The shoreline consisted of exposed rock and shingle beach, with no caves, structures, or vegetation capable of hiding 15 men. Yet the figures had disappeared as if they had never existed, leaving O'Brien questioning his own senses and reluctant to report what he had witnessed. The timing of O'Brien's sighting created an impossible contradiction that destroyed every rational explanation Harwick had constructed. If the fisherman's testimony was accurate, the missing crew members had been walking the shoreline at 2:30 p.m., 90 minutes after their abandoned boats were discovered and nearly 8 hours after they had supposedly died from carbon monoxide poisoning aboard the Celestial. The magnetic anomaly theory, the toxic gas hypothesis, and the medical explanations that had seemed so convincing all collapsed when confronted with credible testimony that placed the missing men alive and moving long after they should have been dead. Harwick faced the professional crisis that had haunted his career since the Cornwall incident, the moment when documented evidence contradicted established maritime knowledge and forced him to choose between rational explanation and witness testimony that suggested forces beyond conventional understanding. O'Brien's delayed statement transformed the celestial investigation from a complex but solvable marine casualty into something that challenged fundamental assumptions about life, death, and the behavior of men who had spent their lives working the boundary between sea and shore. Standing in his temporary office as darkness fell over St. John's Harbor, Harwick realized that his 20 years of investigative experience had brought him to the edge of a mystery that rational analysis could not penetrate, where the tools of methodical inquiry revealed only deeper questions about what had happened to 15 men who had walked away from death itself and continued walking long after they should have found peace in the depths of Newfoundland's unforgiving waters. The collapse of rational explanation drove Harwick into the kind of methodical retreat that had sustained him through previous professional crises. But this time, his systematic approach led not toward clarity, but deeper into maritime folklore that challenged everything he understood about the relationship between ships, men, and the sea itself. Patrick O'Brien's testimony had shattered the environmental theory that Lloyd's of London required for insurance settlement, leaving Harwick with witness accounts that demanded either wholesale dismissal of credible testimony or acceptance that the celestial incident lay beyond the boundaries of conventional maritime experience. The Lloyd's archives in St. John's contained historical records dating back to the establishment of regular shipping routes through Newfoundland waters, and Harwick's investigation of similar incidents revealed a pattern that professional maritime circles had consistently ignored or explained away through convenient attribution to weather, human error, or equipment failure. The files contained 3 documented cases spanning nearly 8 decades, each involving the unexplained disappearance of experienced crew members from vessels that showed no sign of conventional marine casualty. The earliest incident had occurred in November 1798, when a 12-man whaling crew vanished from their vessel after approaching a grounded merchantman off the Nova Scotia coast. The rescue ship had found the whaler's boat still secured to the wreck, with personal effects and whaling equipment arranged as if the crew had paused in their work and simply walked away. The official investigation had attributed the disappearance to a rogue wave that swept the men overboard simultaneously, despite calm weather conditions and the absence of any physical evidence supporting such an explanation. The 1823 case involved a Royal Navy salvage team assigned to recover cargo from a frigate that had foundered near Cape Breton during autumn gales. 8 experienced naval personnel had boarded the wreck under perfect working conditions, following established Admiralty protocols for salvage operations in dangerous waters. When the support vessel returned the following day, they found the salvage equipment properly stowed and work areas organized according to naval procedure, but no trace of the men who had been performing routine cargo recovery. The naval inquiry had concluded that the salvage team had been overcome by toxic gases from the ship's damaged stores, though no evidence of atmospheric contamination was ever documented. The most recent precedent had occurred in September 1851, when the crew of a Gloucester fishing schooner had discovered their captain and 5 men missing after investigating a derelict vessel drifting in fog-shrouded waters off the Grand Banks. The remaining crew members reported that their shipmates had rowed across to examine the abandoned vessel for salvage value, following standard practice for mariners who supplemented fishing income through recovery of maritime debris. Hours later, when fog cleared enough to reveal both vessels clearly, the fishing boat was found drifting empty, while the derelict showed no sign of the boarding party that should have been conducting their examination. Each historical case shared characteristics that aligned disturbingly with the celestial incident: experienced maritime personnel disappearing from vessels under excellent working conditions, leaving behind organized work areas and personal effects that suggested orderly departure rather than emergency evacuation. More significantly, each case had occurred in areas where subsequent geological surveys revealed substantial mineral deposits capable of creating magnetic anomalies that affected navigation instruments and potentially human physiology in ways that contemporary medical knowledge could not explain. The pattern suggested either a conspiracy of maritime authorities to suppress evidence of supernatural phenomena, or the existence of environmental conditions that science had not yet learned to recognize and measure. Harwick's professional training inclined him toward environmental explanation, but his growing understanding of the evidence demanded consideration of forces that lay beyond the scope of maritime insurance investigation. The breakthrough that transformed speculation into working theory came from an unexpected source: the Celestial's original cargo manifest, which revealed that the grounded steamer had been carrying more than prairie wheat and agricultural equipment. Buried in the supplementary documentation that accompanied complex cargo shipments was a listing for navigational instruments and precision timepieces, consigned to the Halifax Maritime Observatory, a collection of experimental chronometers being shipped for calibration and testing in different magnetic environments. The timepiece cargo had been loaded in the Celestial's forward hold, directly beneath the wheelhouse where the most significant temporal anomalies had been discovered. The manifest indicated that the shipment included 12 marine chronometers set to different time zones, 6 experimental compass chronometer combinations designed to maintain accuracy despite magnetic interference, and a prototype temporal navigation system that used multiple timepieces to calculate position based on astronomical observations rather than magnetic compass readings. The implications of the concealed cargo transformed Harwick's understanding of what had occurred aboard the Celestial on the morning of October 12th. If the grounding had damaged the experimental timepieces, creating some form of temporal distortion field around the wreck site, it might explain both the stopped clocks found throughout the ship and the crew's apparent displacement from normal time flow. The wet footprints leading to the ship's bow suddenly took on new significance as evidence that 15 men had followed a temporal current as real to them as any ocean tide, walking toward a shoreline that existed in a different moment from the wreck they had abandoned. The temporal displacement theory provided a framework for understanding Patrick O'Brien's impossible sighting of the missing crew members walking the coastline hours after their disappearance. If the damaged experimental equipment had created a field that displaced the salvage crew to a different temporal position, they might have reached shore in a time period that overlapped with O'Brien's fishing activities while remaining invisible to searchers operating in normal time flow. Harwick's investigation of the Halifax Maritime Observatory revealed that the experimental navigation system had been developed in response to increasing magnetic interference affecting North Atlantic shipping routes, particularly in areas where iron ore deposits created compass deviation problems similar to those documented around the Celestial wreck site. The prototype equipment was designed to maintain temporal accuracy even under extreme magnetic conditions, but the theoretical framework suggested that catastrophic damage to multiple synchronized timepieces might create temporal effects that the designers had never anticipated. The scientific foundation for temporal displacement remained theoretical, existing at the intersection of maritime navigation, magnetic physics, and chronometer mechanics that few investigators possessed the technical background to evaluate properly. But the evidence pattern supported the theory's central premise that the Celestial incident represented not death but translation, with 15 experienced salvage workers becoming unstuck from their proper temporal position and following chronological currents toward a shoreline that existed in parallel time rather than normal space. As Harwick prepared his final report for Lloyd's of London, he faced the professional challenge that had defined his career since the Cornwall failure: The choice between rational explanation that satisfied bureaucratic requirements and truth that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality itself. The temporal displacement theory provided both scientific framework and evidentiary support for what had happened to Morris Sullivan's crew, but presenting such conclusions to maritime insurance authorities would effectively end his investigative career while opening questions about the nature of time, causation, and human consciousness that lay far beyond the scope of marine casualty investigation. Standing in his temporary office as another Newfoundland evening settled over St. John's Harbor, Harwick realized that his investigation had led him not toward answers, but toward recognition that some maritime mysteries transcended the boundary between rational inquiry and forces that operated according to laws that human understanding had not yet learned to recognize, much less control or predict with the precision that professional survival demanded.